go through the question that Senator Adair had brought up. So starting out, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators, congresspersons, etc. Then what we've got is a direct step into state law in terms of how these are to be appointed. And in state law, what happens is qualified political parties are tapped into and elect electors at their state party conventions. Presidential elector nominees of the party whose nominees for president receive the highest number of votes at the general election shall be elected presidential electors of the state. And in New Mexico, it's a winner-take-all system, and each shall be granted a certificate of election by the state canvassing board. So that's a sort of an interesting key thing as well. These folks are actually elected officials under state law, and they receive a certificate of election. She might be over here. Which one do I hit on? Just the down. And then federal, continuing with Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, Federal Statutes, Title 3, the electors of President and Vice President shall be appointed in each state on the Tuesday next after the first Monday in November in every fourth year succeeding every election of President and Vice President. So this should look very familiar. We've talked about this before. This is Election Day. This is when we all go to the polls in November and vote for President. But instead of voting for President and Vice President, what we're actually voting for is we're voting for electors. We talked about that. We talked about the 1960 election in Alabama, the fact that that ballot was a long ballot. It didn't show the presidential candidates. Nixon and Kennedy weren't even on there, but instead it had the party electors that were established. So we've got this interaction between federal constitution, state law, and federal law. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3, superseded by the 12th Amendment. Electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for the President and Vice President, two separate ballots, that's the 12th Amendment, and transmit sealed to the seat of government of the United States directed to the President of the Senate. Okay, so what we know, after the November election, we know who wins within the state. The electors have already been determined at the state party conventions, who those electors are going to be, and those persons shall meet in their states and cast their ballots. Federal law then kicks in. The electors of President and Vice President in each state shall meet and give their votes on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December next, following their appointment at such time in each state legislature as such state shall direct. So they're meeting in December. Federal law determines when. State law determines when as well. Presidential election. The state shall meet at 11 o'clock in the office of the Secretary of State, the day fixed by laws of the U.S. So we saw the federal law. This is how state law factors into it. Then Lana talked about this at length at our other meeting. This is what the electors are doing. Okay, they're voting, and they've got these certificates of votes given to them. Title 3, Chapter 1, Section 9. And then this is what they do with those certificates. And the key thing is, one of them goes by registered mail to the President of the Senate, the seat of government. So by the middle of December, we've got the electors casting their votes, right? And they're sending those registered mail to the President of the Senate based on this combination of state and federal law. Person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be president if the number is a majority. Under federal law, Congress shall be in session the 6th day of January. So again, we've got the November election, we've got the December voting by the Electoral College, by the electors, and then on the 6th day of January, Senate and the House is going to meet in joint session, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The President of the Senate is the presiding officer. They identify two tellers, and those people are going to be the folks that are counting the votes that come through on their certificate. Going back, remember we saw that it said if there's a majority, this is probably superfluous, I'm not sure that we need to go through it. Person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be president if the number is a majority. The votes, if there's no majority, meaning if you have 4 candidates, they each get 25% or whatever, and then if no person have such majority, then from the persons having the highest numbers not exceeding 3 on the list of those voted for as president, previously that number was 5, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the president. So we've got this process that they've got in place in case there's no one that gets a majority of the electoral votes. But in choosing the president, the vote shall be taken by states, representation from each state having 1 vote. So if we go to this House process that they've got established, each state does not get the number of votes that they pass based on their congressional delegation. Each state only gets 1 vote. Quorum is 2/3 of the state. A state delegation cannot decide on a candidate. That state cannot participate in that vote. And again, this is only when there's not somebody with a majority. So now I want to summarize a couple of the principles that we also talked about. That structural bit, and does anybody have any questions on any of that? No. Summary of some of the principles that we've talked about. U.S. constitutional right to vote for, we have a U.S. constitutional right to vote for congressmen. We talked about that. As of 1913, we have a constitutional right to vote for senators. What we do not have is we do not have a U.S. constitutional right to vote for the president or the vice president. We also do not have a constitutional right to vote for presidential electors. You'll note when we first started, the Constitution says the legislature shall determine how electors are going to be selected, how they're going to be appointed. And in fact, early on in the country's history, legislatures did make the decision. It was out of them. There is, however, there's one state in the country, Colorado, that has a constitutional provision that provides a state constitutional right to vote for presidential electors. So structurally, this is what we're working with now. If there are any questions on that structural stuff, now what I want to do is I want to go into a discussion on the death or disqualification of a candidate. All right, so what I just talked about, I walked through this process that we have. We've got national party conventions, which is where candidates for president are actually determined, right? So there's 4 periods that we're looking at in terms of a problem with the death, disability, or disqualification of a candidate. And that starts at the time that the National Party Convention identifies who that is. I'm not sure what it was this last time around, but typically July, August, September timeframe is when that occurs. So party convention and November election, that's the first period we're looking at. Then there's a period between the November election and the day the electors meet in December. Talked about that. That's the second Wednesday after the first Monday, or whatever that was. Then we have a period between the day the electors vote in December and January 6th, which is when the House and Senate meet in joint session to count the electoral votes. Then we have a 4th period between January 6th and the inauguration of the president-elect and vice president, which is on January 20th. So the question that Senator Derrick asked was, what happens if a candidate dies after the election, but before they're inaugurated? But taking that question and sort of honing it down, there are 4 different periods that actually are of concern in this process, and it's addressed slightly differently in these different periods. So in the first period, between adjournment of the National Convention and the November election, there's no federal law that addresses this contingency. So after the National Party Convention, what happens if somebody dies or is disqualified? Democratic and Republican parties have adopted procedures to address that contingency. For the Democratic Party, rules provide that members of the Democratic National Committee have the power to fill that vacancy. For the Republican Party, the rules authorize the Republican National Committee to fill any vacancy. Alternatively, the Republican Party Committee is authorized to call a new convention if there's enough time. Now, what I will mention on this, and I actually went on and printed out the new rules, but I couldn't find it in there. These rules actually date back. They're probably prior to 2001. And so it's possible that they've changed, but the bottom line on this is, between the time of the National Party Convention and the time of election, there's really no federal law, certainly not a constitutional provision, that addresses how that individual is to get replaced. But the parties do have methods for addressing that. So we've never had a presidential candidate die between the National Convention and Election Day. However, 1912, Republican vice presidential candidate James Sherman, this was under Taft, died on October 30. Placement had not been named by the party before the election. However, the Republican National Committee met and instructed Republican electors to cast their vice presidential vote for Nicholas Murray Butler. Okay, so this was a way that the Republican Party handled this contingency, this issue of a candidate who died after the National Convention before the election. And then folks may remember this, but in '72, I don't know if everyone remembers the details of this, but Thomas Eagleton resigned after being nominated for vice president under McGovern. And then the Democratic National Committee actually assembled and selected Sergeant Shriver to replace him. So there are ways of handling it. Now, okay, now let's look at from between November election and the day the electors meet in December. Okay, this is about a 5-week process. In theory, the electors would be free to vote for anyone they pleased, but the National Party rules for filling vacancies by the national committees would still be in effect. Electors would probably respect the National Party Committee's decision on a replacement. Another option, election of the VP candidate to the presidential slot. This is probably what would happen if the presidential candidate died. The only time a candidate died in this period was in 1872 when the defeated Democratic presidential nominee Horace Greeley died on November 29th, 3 weeks after the election. 66 electors were pledged to Greeley and met to cast their votes the day he was buried. 63 electors cast their electoral vote to a variety of different Democrats. 3 electors from Georgia cast their ballots for Greeley. Now this is interesting because it comes into play as we go through these other periods. Those 3 votes for Greeley were rejected by Congress. They were rejected because he had died before the electors cast their ballots. Okay, the third period, between the day the electors vote and January 6th, when the House and Senate meet in joint session. Okay, so National Party rules no longer govern what's going on. Federal law would apply. There would clearly be debate about whether votes cast for a dead man or woman could be counted. However, if you look at the 20th Amendment, Congress would have no discretion in the matter and would declare that the deceased candidate had received whatever number of votes that individual got. There's no choice. So once those votes are cast by the electors, they've been cast. And so they go to that particular candidate. And so the operative Section 3 of Section 3 of the 20th Amendment, quote, if at the time fixed for the beginning of the term of the president, the vice president-elect shall have died, the vice president-elect shall become president, and when the vice president-elect shall become president, he or she would be authorized under the 25th Amendment to nominate a new vice president. So this is what would happen in that time period. Then between January 6th and January 20th, I mean, it's basically the same thing. You've got, if the president dies, you've got a vice presidential person, somebody that ascends to that level, is sworn in, and appoints a vice president. And then there's also this question, in the event neither the president-elect nor the vice president-elect are able to serve on January 20th, then there's the Succession Act of 1947 that kicks in. Speaker of the House would be first, President pro tem of the Senate, and then it goes to cabinet officials from there. So that's that process. I think the key thing, let's start with you, right? Mm-hmm. The key thing on this, I'm not sure quite how to phrase this. The reason I think, and I don't want to speak for Senator Adair, but I want to bring this up, I think he was concerned that there is some difference in how this process would work under the current electoral college system and under the compact system that this NPVI process proposes, that there would be a difference. And so when you go through all that law that I put up there, none of that changes at all, except for the provision in state law that says how those electoral college, or those electoral votes are awarded. So it all stays the same. There's no real change in that law. There's no real change in the progression of what's going to happen between how the electoral college works right now and how it would work under this particular system. So that's all mine. If you have any questions.
Okay, so one of the things that the Electoral College does, and one of the questions that comes up is, what's the effect of the Electoral College on presidential campaigning? And the bottom line is that battleground states get more attention than blackout states. Blackout states are states that don't get any attention. They don't get any money, they don't get any resources, and they don't get any visits. Occasionally they get a visit because they're a flyover state, so they get presidential candidate will come in for, to help a congressional candidate or a Senate candidate or something like that. So let's think about how in the current process the presidential campaigns go about targeting states. And it's really interesting, most states are not competitive. Most states easily go one way or the other. And if you've ever looked at all 50 states, it's pretty amazing the variation between the states in their vote, in how they vote for the Democratic and Republican candidates. And it's fairly consistent over time. And so they have a lot of reliable information. So they think about basically, they define states as either base Democratic, marginal Democratic, battleground, marginal Republican, base Republican. Base Republican and base Democratic states basically get no attention. They know they're going to win those states. They don't put any resources into those states. No money goes into those states. So this is an example of prior to the election in 1992. This is an example of the Republican and Democratic parties' assessment of their own campaign targets and what states were in what category. So the top row is the GOP and the column is the Democrats. So I apologize, we should say marginal Democrat here, right? Or marginal again. These should be marginal Democrat base. No, that's right. Sorry, that's right. So I think what's really neat about this, right? So you get everything's basically on the diagonal. These are independent interviews with these campaign managers in 1992, prior to the beginning of the election. Notice the similarity, right? The fact that everything's on the diagonal says that they're all agreeing about what states. There's no disagreement. They have really good data. They basically agree. I think Pennsylvania's a disagreement. It's a battleground state for Republicans, and it's a marginal Democratic state for Democrats. So that's a disagreement. But most of them are all agreeing, right? They all agree on where the states are. So they use the same information to come up with this. And they do this in advance. There's a dynamic process to the campaign because things change. And so a state, maybe could become a battleground, or more likely, as the campaign progresses, fewer and fewer states become battlegrounds and candidates start pulling out their money as it becomes clear that they're not going to win that state. We saw that really pretty dramatically in 2008. Occasionally, you have someone with a lot of money in 1992. Clinton was able to, he was always sort of on top, so he sort of kept expanding some of his campaign activity in 1992. So they really agree. They use the same information. So there's a lot of symmetry. They use this data, polling and television advertising data, electoral vote totals, previous statewide election results. Right? So those are sort of the key things that they think about in thinking about where they're going to put their resources. So they do consider sort of the cost of being in a particular stage, which is the television advertising data. How much is that going to cost us? How many points do I get? So that's what they're really looking at, those hit points, those GRP points that campaigns use to determine how much hits they're getting in any particular media market. Yeah, Rhonda?
Oh, I was just noting what you're, so The primary, there's a consensus that the primary use, or the primary data, is their polling intelligence, the electoral vote totals, and previous statewide results. And so, if you think about national popular vote and how it would affect that, I was just trying to think that through.
And we're gonna get there. So
Okay.
I just want to present a
Right.
few more slides, and that's where I'm going. A discussion. I try to have a discussion about how we think the campaign would be altered if we were to move to national popular vote. Something about polling. Just I was in a polling firm in '94 in Colorado, and I mean it's just amazing once you get to like and I knew those people in '96, and so they were doing polling for the presidential candidates, and so they get into the field and they're just constantly in all of these states polling. I mean, it's just an ongoing process for the candidate. Obama is accumulating massive amounts of data right now on the states, and he does all of these experiments as part of his campaign. So there's quite a bit of data on this, and so there was this guy, Darren Shaw, and he modeled this, and he did all these interviews and stuff like that. And his model shows that electoral votes do not make certain states more attractive. So if you're a big state, if you're California, if you're Texas, that doesn't mean that you're going to get a lot of attention. In fact, those states are blackout states, and so they get no attention. So the size of your population, how many electoral college votes, doesn't matter. Smallness doesn't matter either. What matters is, are you competitive? Are you a battleground state? What he finds is it that in terms of where they place their resources, in terms of candidate visits and ad expenditures, is that the interaction of advertising costs, how much does it cost, how many hits am I getting, with electoral votes that leads to the targeting of states, and the interaction of competitiveness with the cost of those TV ads are the main considerations in how they spend their resources. If you read all of his article, you come away with the following. Candidates concentrate resources in the battleground states. Marginal states receive fewer resources, but they receive some. So those states that are surrounding the marginal, is that, or the battlegrounds are the ones we saw back here. These battleground states, the marginal states are on either side of that. They get a little attention, they get a little resources, but not a lot. Few resources are expended in base states. They hardly put any of their money in those states that they know they're going to win. And they also are responsive to each other, so there's a sort of tit-for-tat strategy. So if your opponent is in a state and they're spending money, there's a lot of pressure for the other presidential candidate to do that as well. So actually late in the campaign in 2008, yeah, Paul.
I didn't mean to interrupt you in mid-sentence, but there could be a subcategory, presume, that says large marginal or large battleground states will receive more attention than
That's
small.
right. And that's true, and I'm going to show you some data on that. That's right. So that's that interaction between electoral votes and competitiveness. So if you're Ohio and you're Florida, so we're a battleground state, but Ohio and Florida get a lot more attention than New Mexico. Though we do pretty well on a per voter basis in terms of spending, so we have a lot more people. In this tit for tat strategy can be also important. So it was really clear at some point in the 2008 race that Obama was going to win New Mexico, but McCain stayed in anyway. Right? He didn't pull his daughters. He didn't pull his resources. I have no idea where that came from. I have no idea. Candidates are sequential in this concept in the race, so they're constantly updating the information. I mean, they are literally in the field running state by state numbers constantly. A lot of money going into this. So who wins in this process? Battleground states. But battleground state is fleeting. And actually, Kim's going to talk about that later. But here's the list of the states that got some attention in the 2008 race. Here's their electoral college votes, and here is their campaign events. So the middle column is how many electoral college votes they have, and then how many campaign events they had in the state. And Ohio had 62. Yeah. So these are, if I remember, these are candidate visits. These are actual, candidate visits. So huge amounts of visits. You can see that Ohio and Florida, with the most electoral votes, and Pennsylvania basically got a lot. We got a lot too, relatively speaking. We got a lot too. I mean, 8. But again, this comes back to really Paul's point, right? Which is this interaction between big state status and lots of electoral votes, competitiveness and electoral votes. And most states, right, all the 362 electoral college votes in the other states got 0 visits. It's important to note. I mean, so the disparity in states that you're seeing here is really large, right? I mean, one state's getting 62 visits. How many states? I don't know how many I have up here. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, maybe 20 states. Not quite 20 states. So there's 30 states. The majority of states receive no visits, receive no attention.
Lana,
Yeah.
one thing that I don't see mentioned in that model that I think has become more and more important is the timing of primaries.
The timing of primaries on general election.
Well, the attention of candidates. For
What are you
instance,
thinking?
well, you're talking about candidate visits per state,
Right.
and if this is tied strictly to the general election, but we all know that
Oh,
for the
yeah.
primary, where did the candidates camp out?
Iowa. And New Hampshire.
Sure, right.
Those are the 2 states that they, yeah, so it's the same kind of thing. You get the same kind of thing there. All of the attention goes to early states, and they've done quite a number of studies on that in nomination campaigns. And, I mean, there's quite a big economic boost for Iowans. But there's not only an economic boost, there's also a policy boost. We have a lot of policy about corn, right? I mean, why do we have so much policy about corn? Well, one reason is probably because Iowa is a presidential, the start of the presidential nomination campaign, and so their policies get more attention. In fact, one of the reasons that states talk about when they say, I want to move up my calendar, I want to front load to the beginning of the nomination race, is because I get more attention. I think the same can be said for some states that are continuous battleground states, that they're more likely to, in this context, get some amount of attention policy-wise, potentially because of their battleground status. So here's a next slide. So this is the number of a whole bunch of states that sort of get attention. How much ad expenditures were spent in those states, peak season after Labor Day into the election, and the percent of donations given by those states, okay, and then how much they're getting, and then this is just a ratio, the percent of peak season ad expenditures over the donations. That's not right. So I don't know, percent of peak season ad expenditures, I'm sorry. I don't know what that is. Oh, it's the percent. Okay, of the total. So that's it. Florida had 18% of all of the expenditures, right? Pennsylvania had 15% of all of the expenditures. Ohio, 10%. New Mexico's down here at, we got about 2% of the total. But that's pretty good because most of the states basically got nothing, right? They got 1.8. All of it, even though most of the campaign donations came from all of those other states, right? So 73% of the donations came from all those other states, but they got less than 2% of the actual ad exposures. So you see that so you see the candidates really focus on particular states. Whoa, because of the Electoral College. Because of the Electoral College. This is my own data from 2008 in terms of activity, because it's not just what the candidates do, there's also a lot of group activity that comes into a state. And so this is the Democratic, and the Democratic Party has a lot more interest groups than the Republican Party, but it's pretty amazing. So we collected, with the help of actually the League of Women Voters and Common Cause members, we asked them to send us all of their mail that they get on the presidential candidates. And in 2008, there were 94 pieces that we recorded across all of those. Obama only sent out, well, he sent out, Obama for America sent out 5. The Democratic Party sent out 35 mailers. And then you have all of these other groups, AFL-CIO, Defenders of Wildlife. So there's a lot of activities. So it's not just what the candidates do, it's also what the groups do. Not a lot of magazines, people don't read magazines anymore. So radio, there were 12 radio ads that we recorded. There were 49 different TV ads, and almost all of them are by Obama, and that's because the rule changes. So all in all, we recorded in 2008 over 200 unique ads that were in play over the course of the election on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, we recorded 152 total ads, with, again, the Republican Party of New Mexico being the highest with 42 ads, and the RNC at 15, and McCain having 4. So groups plus candidates equal a lot of resources going into the states. This is also data we collected in 2008, and we visited all of the radio stations in the Albuquerque metro area and the TV stations in the Albuquerque metro area. And so you can see that there was a lot of money spent, not only again by the presidential candidate Obama for America and McCain for president, that's about $6 million, but also all of these interest groups that participated and purchased ads and purchased time on radio and TV. So there's just a tremendous amount, and we all know this because we live here and we're inundated with an amazing amount of information and calls. In fact, so much that we probably get sort of tired of it. I don't know if you guys get tired of it. For me, it's a rock concert. I don't know about for you. This has an impact on voters. All of this activity has a huge impact on voters, and that's really important. So if we think about it, the thing is, well, campaigning influences voters' behavior. That's our theory, that the more you campaign, the more voters respond to that. However, it's important to remember that in the case of presidential elections, they're sort of nationalized. Even though a state gets any particular attention, they're nationalized in terms of TV coverage. Campaign events everywhere get covered on the TV. There's lots and lots of free information when it comes to presidential campaigns, even if you're in California. So those kinds of things probably stimulate interest and things like that in those other states as well. So some of the differences between battleground and blackout states are reduced because of the national attention that they receive. There's a bunch of studies on this. In terms of voter turnout, there is evidence that being a battleground state increases your turnout once you control for all kinds of activity. This woman did a recent article, and this really interacts with the competitiveness of the race. So if we look back at 1992, there's no difference between non-competitive, between battleground states and blackout states. But if you get to 2004, and the article didn't get to 2008, you get a 6% difference. So there's some sort of interaction. In 2000, it was a 3% difference. In 1988, it was a 3% difference. So there's some sort of interaction. Voters recognize whether or not a race is competitive on top of all the attention they're getting. There's a message. I mean, there was really no doubt that Clinton was going to win the 1996 election, and certainly by election day it was clear that Bush was going to lose in 1992. But there is a pretty big effect. I mean, 6% is a huge amount of people in battleground states who are turning out and getting stimulated in a way that voters in other states are not. And the parties have gotten so much better at this over time in terms of their micro-targeting, and I mean, all of that is just, really playing a bigger role. So it could be that some of the things that we saw in the early years may disappear because we do have so much more micro-targeting, so much more, door knocking, personal contacts. We know how important those are. We weren't doing those prior to 2000, 2004, when we really started doing those again, especially with political parties. So this has an effect on voters, and it has effect sort of on their interest and their action knowledge. At least their knowledge. It's clear that they have their knowledge, their action in terms of their behavior, they vote more. Interestingly, though, even though that's the case, there's no evidence that, in terms of interest, there's no evidence that just how interested you are in the campaign, having all that stimulation doesn't make you more interested, though it might make you turn out. Okay, all that mobilization work, but it doesn't make you more interested in the race. even though it's very clear that people who are in battleground states are more exposed. They report being more exposed to mail, TV, all of that. So it's very clear that the survey's capturing the fact that they're getting more stimulated, but it doesn't have an effect on their overall interest. There is some evidence that citizens of battleground states participate in more campaign activities. They go to more rallies, probably because there are more rallies in place. But they also tend to volunteer more. They're more likely to convince others. They're more likely to step up and say, hey, you know, here's the reason why you should vote for John McCain or Obama. So they do that, and they're more likely to, you know, wear a button or put a sign in the yard or things like that. So there is some evidence that they do more activity. I think for me, the convincing others is the most exciting one, but they're also really interesting. And there's a lot of evidence that they learn more. So people in battle states learn more about the candidates. They're more able to explain why they like and dislike the candidates, from both parties. So that's interesting. So, you know, what can we say about New Mexicans then? New Mexicans are more likely to turn out. They're more likely to be talking about politics and the presidential campaign, because we're a battleground state compared to the blackout states. And they're more likely to have knowledge, information. So what the campaign's doing is providing them with a great deal of information, and they are receiving that information. Which, you know, I mean, that's good for campaigns to know they're receiving that information.
Lauren, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Is there any evidence that battleground states have a different dynamic in their population? Are we more mobile? Are there more people that tend to be moving into battleground states? Is there anything different about us?
You have any ideas? Not really.
Other than partisanship.
Yeah, 50-50. Yeah, they're just more competitive, yeah. And there's a couple of states that have been battleground states sort of forever, Ohio. But most states, it's very fleeting. But we'll talk more about that. Yeah, I don't know what it is. Yeah, that's a good question. What is it, the characteristic of the state that makes them a battleground state? There's also this added bonus for people who are in a low income status. There's also quite a bit of evidence that these individuals in particular benefit from being in a battleground state. So if you're not in a battleground state, these people just drop out. But these people actually do show an increase in interest in the election. If they're sort of low SES voters, and they are more likely to become involved in the campaign across a variety of indicators. So there's sort of an effect for everyone, but there's especially strong effect for, you know, voters who are in a particular class, who are more difficult, less likely to participate in the political system in general. Okay. I think this is sort of interesting, so let me just pass this out. So these are turnout rates in 2008 by state, and I'm using the voting eligible population. I'm sorry, Maggie and Bobby, you don't have this. It's a handout because it has all the states on it. Actually, you know what? I want to come back to this. I don't want to talk about this right now, but you can look at it. It's interesting just to think about how turnout difference. One question that we've had raised in the last 2 sessions was, do voters understand the Electoral College? And so we tried to look into that. We did find that there was a poll prior to the 2000 election, prior to the actual outcome of the election, by ABC News, and 78% of likely voters indicated that they understood how the Electoral College works. I find that really hard to believe. My experience is not so good. But what I think that means, if we give an interpretation to that, what I think it means is that people understand that it's not the popular vote, and that there's this Electoral College that meets, but they don't understand that there's, you know, how the composition of that, or how, you know, necessarily how all of that is determined. Okay, but they do have a sense that it's not the national popular vote. So I do think they understand that aspect of it. They know it's not about voters, it's about state outcomes. So I I do believe that that's what they know. Very limited knowledge, but it is something. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute asks about political knowledge and civics, and it was really interesting because on this question, people actually got the answer right more often than elected officials. Yeah, I know. It's pretty bad. So they find that 66% of Americans, and it was like 55% of elected officials, know what the Electoral College does. And the question was, the United States Electoral College trains those aspiring for higher political office, was established to supervise the first televised presidential debate, is otherwise known as the U.S. Congress, is a constitutionally mandated assembly that elects the president, and was ruled undemocratic by the Supreme Court. And so 66% of the public did get that right. So that does confirm at least somewhat what ABC News found. That they have some sense of the process. They recognize that it's not just an accumulation of the national popular vote. I don't know what that says about elected officials. What I wanted to know, and they didn't say in the article, was what the mode was for the elected officials.
You know what it says about elected officials. You just don't want to repeat it.
Okay, that's an important point. Did you hear Maggie said that's not counting clerks?
Yeah.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Maggie. That's true. That's true. They understand the process. So in terms of this just came out. This just came out last week, so I thought it was pretty interesting. So I included it. This was a voter attitudes towards the Electoral College and national popular vote, and this was done by Gallup, the national poll. Thinking for a moment about the way in which the president is elected in this country, which would you prefer, to amend the Constitution so the candidate who receives the most total votes nationwide wins the election, or to keep the current system in which the candidate who wins the most votes in the Electoral College wins the election? And, clearly popular vote's a winner over the Electoral College. And these are the years, right? So this is going back in time. They've been asking this over the last decade. And you can go back actually in time and go back to the 40s and the 50s, and there's this sort of, this is a consistent picture in terms of public attitudes. But it's pretty unchanged. There was some change in this after the 2000 election, actually. There was some, partisan sort of changes, but it looks like those have eroded at this point. So here's voter attitudes by party. And this is going back, so you can sort of see, so Democrats, they supported overwhelmingly, 3/4 of Democrats. Independents supported at a majority. Republicans, right at 2001, this was a shift. So this was right after the, Gore-Bush thing, and that actually is a change of opinion from previous polls. But you can see that that's been eroding over time as we've gotten further and further away from the 2000 election. So there was a partisan, change after the 2000 election for Republicans, where they saw that they benefited from the process as it current standard, at least that year, so that there wasn't a majority. Though they were a majority before that, is my understanding. But then by 2012 or by 2011, right, because this was done. They're at just over a majority. So there's been, there's some change there. They did respond in the election. So here's the trend in support. Would you approve or disapprove an amendment to the Constitution which would do away with the Electoral College and base the election of a president on a total vote cast throughout the nation? And you can see that this, and I'm just putting this in there so you can see sort of the historical trend and how it's the same.
In their polling, did you do any exploration of why they supported or did not support?
Did not,
the
no.
amendment?
No, I didn't have access to the data.
Okay.
This literally came out 3 days ago. So I just stuck it out. I was like, wow, that was timely. That was timely for our meeting. But there is this really interesting case, which I think is worth talking about, which is Colorado in 2004. And in Colorado in 2004, they actually had a constitutional amendment on the ballot that said, we're going to give our votes on a district basis instead of the way we do it now. And so going into the election, there was all this support among everybody for that process. But then Colorado became a battleground state. And suddenly it was like, wow, Colorado might decide the election, and what does that mean if we change the process for how we give our votes? And so the constitutional amendment, it was defeated overwhelmingly. Both Democratic, so early on it looked like it wasn't going to have any problems, but then both Democratic leaders and Republican leaders came out against the measure really strongly. And importantly, there was a clause in the initiative that said it will take place this year, right? So it was retroactive. If it passed, they would have to reallocate their votes based upon the outcome this time. And so that went down in defeat 65 to 35 in that process. So of course, that's in the context of thinking that every other state is, or not, 95% of the states are winner take all. And so, so it's sort of interesting.
The explanation of why that happened, what's the explanation?
Of why that happened? Why did they do that?
The fact that they all of a sudden became a battleground state, and then all of a sudden it's like, we don't want this, we don't want districting.
Yes.
And the reason, the explanation is,
Yes.
both parties
Yes.
viewed, we are going to benefit if we only have a small margin of victory by getting all electoral votes.
That's right. That's
So it
right.
was politically driven.
It's politically driven, and I think, yeah, and this is a good time to, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, are you going to talk about Pennsylvania?
Yeah,
Nebraska?
I thought that would be a good time to
Perfect.
talk about that. So I actually have,
Oh, and I was going to, I
Yeah,
served
go
in the
ahead.
legislature, making
Yeah.
a comment that, first of all, I support the direction of the constitutional amendment on this, and I know California, I think, just passed
yeah, they
some
do.
legislation, and we've had it presented in New Mexico. But we are a battleground state, and many of my colleagues, have exactly the attitude that you just discussed about Colorado. We're a battleground state, and we don't want to lose that majority. Some think that they actually have some additional, juice with the administration as a result of being a battleground state. I'm not sure how true that really is, but
Right. Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, yeah. Paul, can you speak to that? Because actually, you've mentioned that to me once.
That's one of the primary reasons we get as much money as we do when we get it, is they perceive us, rightly or wrongly, as a battleground state. We did not get as much money in 2008. Sort of foregone conclusion as things went along, but in 2004 and 2000, we got a ton of it. So money doesn't drive it all, but it does help us with our down ballot races. It helps us with party building to get out the vote, getting people registered. It's not just tied to a presidential election, it's the whole colossus that is our election and voting system. And if we're not perceived as a battleground state, I'm pretty sure there will be no state between Arizona and Texas like usually happens. Well, like they'll just you're from Mexico? I know.
Yeah.
So, but we can tell that. I hear it anecdotally. I hear it directly. And I would hate to lose long term. We're going to fade in and out as a battleground state. You're never on the point of the spear all the time, but I would hate to lose that tension. It certainly hurts our party.
I wanted to comment also. Senator Fishman, I appreciate you being here and I appreciate your comments. One of the things that has been discussed in some of the prior meetings that we had is this sort of tension that exists between the benefit New Mexico receives as being a swing state / battleground state and this whole emphasis, the principle, the idea of one person, one vote, the idea that the voter is the important aspect of this and whether or not the voter is compelled to participate in the franchise in a blackout state or how they're compelled to participate in a blackout state versus a battleground state. So there's this sort of competing values that have been a bit of a theme through this process. And so the question is, when we talk about individuals who are elected officials and they're elected from a popular standpoint within their districts, we've got Congress people who are elected within their district. We've got senators who are elected popularly within the state. At the state level, senators and legislators are all elected popularly within their district. then we've got this presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate that represent the district of the United States, yet they're not popularly elected. And so the question is, how does that question, how do you follow through with that question? What are the values that we hold, and does it have to do with, is there a difference between someone, their incentive to vote in a blackout state versus their incentive to vote in a battleground state? So, anyway, I wanted to throw that out there.
I guess my one thought would be, as I can point to something like ethanol subsidies, which every scientist at the time knew was just nonsense, and where we're spending $8 or $9 billion a year, I can't remember the exact number, but multiple billions of dollars